Now, hedge fund manager Ray Dalio says the role of monetary policy since the financial crisis has been, quote, remarkable. Bridgewater Associates was one of the few hedge funds to make money during the 2008 crisis. That made Dalio something of a celebrity, with policymakers around the world seeking his advice. Now he just put his story and ideas, very unusual management ideas, in a book called Principles. And he spoke to Bloomberg's Erik Schatzker ahead of the publication and gave his assessment of policymakers.
There's fiscal policy and there's monetary policy, and that's what they're doing. If I take monetary policy, I think that they have done a remarkable job, that we have had what I call a significant, beautiful deleveraging. And what I mean is that our debt burdens and our debt service burdens have gone down while the economy has grown, and we haven't had an inflation problem. And they did that by understanding the mechanics and the engineering, and I really do think, to some extent, I was able to be of some help in terms of that exercise, but I think they've done a beautiful job. And so if you look at the economy right now, for the shorter term where we are, we have a situation where we don't have too much inflation and too little inflation, and we don't have too much growth and too little growth, and we don't have a debt bubble, and so on. We have something that is reasonable in terms of those types of conditions. This is very different than 2008. We have a political situation which is difficult. We have a wealth gap and an opportunity gap, which is a difficult situation. And we have very big obligations coming forward, pension obligations, health care obligations that are going to be a burden. That's going to be a gradual problem. But the way that those those who are running monetary policies have handled that well. By and large, fiscal policy I think reasonably well. It's a very much more politicized area. So
that's a much more favorable characterization than a lot of people would give fiscal policy. Most people would give fiscal policy 2 thumbs down.
Yeah. You hear a hesitancy in terms of my giving it compliments relative to the other, but I think that the political environment itself is such a difficult environment, and so politics itself is dysfunctional. And I mean, we have to talk about how to deal with idea of meritocratic, thoughtful decision-making. That's a different question. But nonetheless, if you take the individuals and you put them in their jobs, and you're asking how do they do in those jobs, all things considered, and that's the problem. Those are things that we have to consider, that they have done in fiscal policy. I think the political system is a very challenging situation.
If you were advising the president, what would you tell him to do, or what would you suggest that he do?
The most important thing is to make sure that we understand what the country's principles are that bind us together rather than those that divide us. To have idea meritocratic decision-making, to try to come up with the best collective decisions, to bring the country together in an idea meritocratic way. I think the period that we're in reminds me very much of 1937, if I was to pick an analogous period of time, because at that time, it was after the financial crisis. We had 29 to 32, which is the equivalent of our 2008, 2009. They printed a lot of money, asset prices went up, interest rates went to zero, and we had a large wealth gap which created populism, analogous. The central bank begins to tighten monetary policy. And then we had a populism, and we had a fall in the stock market, and we had conflict.
So we are once again at that precipice?
Well, yes, we have we cannot have tightening of monetary policy that's material. We have a very large wealth gap, a very large gap that the top 0.2% of the population's wealth equals the bottom 90% of the population's wealth. And it's not just wealth, there's a polarity. And this is a time where we have both of those things. if you can't have an economic downturn because socially and politically we could not stand an economic downturn, right? We will be at each other's throats. It's a threat to our system, right? So it's in many ways analogous, that those tensions, that conflict, I think it's in many ways analogous. So that's fearful to me. So when you ask what I would recommend the President of the United States to do, is to try to deal with conflict well, to bring people together, to not make one side in a battle with the other side, and to try to have idea meritocratic ways to get at the best decisions. That's what I would recommend the President do.